Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. This is our third episode with the Wampanoag Sachem Massasoit's name in the title. It was supposed to be the last, but there will be one more. He's been an exciting guy for me to consider. He was complex and very savvy in his handling of the Pilgrims. He helped them to survive. He did seem genuine in his friendship, but they also served a purpose for his own ends. Defense, security, trade, information. This was a calculated friendship. Last week, we spent the majority of our time working through the illness and recovery of Massasoit. And by illness, we mean what appears to be a legitimate near-death experience. And the intercession of Edward Winslow probably saved his life. It certainly cemented any personal friendship that had begun. There were plenty of political reasons to befriend the newcomers, but this kindness went beyond the political. It was on the way back to Plymouth from the healing of Massasoit that our next adventure takes root. Well, it's when the folks at Plymouth became aware of a very dangerous situation that had begun to develop the previous year in 1622. Now, I initially titled this episode Massasoit Part 3, The Necessity of Friends. But I decided on Massasoit Part 3, The Weymouth Massacre. And I decided on this change because both the warning and the advice on how to proceed came from Massasoit. And I do believe that he was sincere in his friendship and warning to the Pilgrims, but I equally believe that he used the relationship to his advantage. Be honest. We all do. It's okay. In today's world, we use benign terms like networking to describe legitimate connections in both private and professional relationships. That's how I kind of understand Massasoit. It was a genuine friendship that was supposed to come with benefits. This was an episode that highlighted just that. So Massasoit offered no direct help to Plymouth on this one. Maybe he didn't think they'd need it. Maybe he couldn't help. Maybe he needed them to establish a strong reputation for themselves. I don't know. There's not a lot said about it. But I do know, or at least am convinced, that he orchestrated a very advantageous outcome to a potentially big problem with very little personal investment. And if I'm correct, and it was intentional, kudos to him. I'm not taking anything away from him. If not, the situation that unfolded and its eventual outcome was still a stroke of genius. I'd just add fortunate as well. He'd hedged his bets, and they paid off. It's a kind of weird thing. Massasoit puts this whole episode in motion, and he may be the largest benefactor in my mind, and yet we'll not spend a whole lot of time talking about him today. 400 years removed, and he will still be the center of the larger storyline. That's impressive. This development should only have been a peripheral event to the Pilgrims, but it ended up being a seminal event for multiple reasons. Like the importance of self-sufficiency, the importance of taking as much responsibility as possible for your own life and reputation. Sometimes the side that you end up on will be picked for you. It may not be your first choice. What will you do then? What side will you take when the crap hits the fan? Or, perhaps more poignantly, how will you react when the problem is real? You are not the source of the problem, but you are threatened with paying the consequence. That's a tough position to be in. Nobody can answer that before the time comes. Nobody can expect to react the same way every time. Life presents challenges, choices. Sometimes there's no good choice. You simply react out of a sense of self-preservation. I think in a lot of ways, the Weymouth Massacre is a powerful illustration of just that kind of situation. Our examination is not aimed at placing blame, but maybe developing the art of thinking or empathizing with tragic figures or situations. You never know. You might find yourself in one or two of these situations. And lastly, attitude and character count. Planning and strategy trump raw determination. So by way of review and background, we've been getting to know a little bit about Massasoit the last few weeks. But there were other things going on in and around Plymouth at the same time. Next week, we're going to finish this kind of sub-series by developing a little bit more of the background and service of Squanto and Hobomok. But for today, we need to finish what we started last week, and that's the healing of Massasoit, because that was only half the story. When the Pilgrims settled Plymouth, there were many preceding events that certainly set the stage for success. Number one, the plagues had cleared the immediate area of Plymouth. Secondly, the Wampanoags were looking for allies. Third, Samoset and Squanto were in the area. Samoset did not have the animosity of many of the local natives towards the English, and he kind of broke the ice. Squanto had world-class life experience and was willing to help. He kind of stood in the gap. And fourthly, not to be forgotten or diminished, Pilgrim diplomacy. Their discernment, humility, in the midst of their vulnerability is striking. So that's the path, or those are the paths, that led to the attempted healing of Massasoit. And that's the path, or those are the paths, that led to Massasoit's recovery. It led to his gratitude and his important information that he passed on. As the Plymouth delegation was leaving Massasoit's town, he informed Hobomok of a plan led by the Massachusetts tribe to attack the English settlements of both Plymouth and Wessaguasset. Now, we've talked about many of the previous ill-fated colonies in the region. And now we want to talk about Wessaguasset. It was a failed colony that followed after Plymouth, after 1620, but predated the great Massachusetts Bay Colony by several years. So it's somewhere in that mid-1620 range. Before we talk about the battle to come, we need to talk about the colony of Wessaguasset and the Massachusetts tribe. They were not only conspirators in this threat, but they were the ringleaders. The Massachusetts tribe was an affiliated group of about 20-something villages that by 1622 had certainly seen better days. These villages were predominantly found around the Massachusetts Bay, modern Salem, Brockton, Greater Boston. Another early colonial name for these people was Aboriginians. And the name means at the Great Hill, the name Massachusetts, or the people of the Great Hill, in reference to the Blue Hills south of Boston Harbor. They had in the past exerted influence on Pawtucket, Nipmuc, and even some of the Wampanoag groups. If you look at a map, many of these groups occupied small geographies when compared to other tribes or confederacies. They were mostly of Algonquin lineage. They shared a similar root language. And plague had affected everybody. The Massachusetts had had a tough couple of decades, immediately preceding the arrival of the Pilgrims. In 1615 to 1619, they went to war with the Tarentine nation of Maine. We know them today as the Penobscots. It had been a very costly war. They lost a lot of people. And in almost that same time frame, from 1616 to 1619, they suffered an epidemic. So there's a dual tragedy, and it decimated their ranks. The Massachusetts were distrustful of Europeans. They were a nation on edge, as you can imagine. They were anxious, understandably so. They were familiar with the Pilgrims because Squanto had introduced Miles Standish to their chief, Chickatawbut, in 1621. Unlike Massasoit, who sought friendship and alliance, Chickatawbut and the Massachusetts stirred up trouble. They ginned up animosity among the other local and regional tribes, probably out of fear more than some innate meanness. At least that's what I'd like to think. Thomas Morton, who preferred to live in mixed communities with both Europeans and natives, and he was not a Puritan, is on record as saying, quote, "I have found the Massachusetts Indian more full of humanity than the Christians," end quote. The Massachusetts, he went on, were, quote, "enraged by Plymouth men's desecration of Sachem family graves," end quote. The Massachusetts word for Englishmen was Wadoquinange, which means stabbers or cutthroats. So whether those labels and those actions by the Pilgrims were warranted or accurate or not, that opinion goes a long way toward explaining their actions. Plus, the Massachusetts did not like Massasoit. So there's that. There's no love lost from either party between Thomas Morton and the folks at Plymouth. The Pilgrims had very little appreciation for him. They claimed that he armed the natives. They claimed that he equipped and trained them with guns and ammunition and powder, and that was a threat to Plymouth. They also thought that he was a very immoral man. So the world's a dangerous place. And this setup underscores the competition or the competitive nature of English relations among the growing and varying groups as well. It's against this backdrop, the recent history prior to Plymouth, the events after the settling of Plymouth. In 1622, a short-lived colony was settled near today's Weymouth, Massachusetts. It was sometimes called the Weston Colony because of its organizer, a London merchant named, you guessed it, Weston, Thomas Weston. Historian Charles Francis Adams Jr. referred to the colony as ill-conceived, ill-executed, and ill-fated. And he was right. By this time, 1622, there was substantial data on establishing a colony. There were plenty of examples of failure, but also, locally, right there at Cape Cod, there was a legitimate colony that was succeeding. And I will say the two groups did have very different mission statements. I mean, to me, the obvious thing to do would have been to duplicate Plymouth. Maybe not the religious aspect. I mean, I get it. Not everybody's going to agree on that. But the Constitution and the governance may have been helpful. The approach that they had taken with the locals. It may not have all been pie in the sky, but there was diplomacy and a genuine attempt at peace. Why wouldn't you ingratiate yourself to the Pilgrims and lean on their experience, learn from them, become friends of their friends? They didn't do that. Thomas Weston was connected with the Plymouth Council for New England. We spoke about these guys before. I mean, this is one of the groups that's affiliated with Ferdinando Gorges. You remember he's a very influential guy back in England that basically had his hand in everything north of Virginia. His vision was a feudalistic type of settlement for profit. He did have an Anglican vision as well. I mean, the goal to Ferdinando Gorges was to make the area the center for Anglicanism in the New World. The question is, what was it that the Pilgrims had left England for? Why did they leave? They left to purify the church. So you can already see there's a tension there, a natural tension. Weston was not a completely inexperienced man. He had helped to get the Pilgrims out of Leyden, but he did not agree with their organization. He didn't agree with their religious piety. He didn't believe that families should go form colonies. He didn't believe in their governance. Weston believed that the successful plantation was made up of single men. He originally sent 60 colonists, no women, no kids, no families. These men were green. They had no colonial experience by and large. They were not hunters and they were not farmers. They did arrive with enough supplies to last for several months. The idea was to hit the ground running, and by the time the supplies ran out, that they'd be self-sufficient. As I've gotten older, I've realized most endeavors, most projects or things that we get involved with are harder and require more thought than we first suspect. Sometimes the confidence of diving right in is more akin to the arrogance of diving right in, and it can have nasty consequences. And I know in a previous episode, we already worked through, the concept. We talked about the challenge that can present itself when men, young men of working ability or soldier age, are far from home and civilization. They don't always behave themselves. They can get themselves into trouble. So, like Thomas Morton, it was a matter of opinion and conviction as to how one thought of Weston. The same historian, Charles Francis Adams Jr., that reported how poorly this colony had gone also put Weston in the same category as Sir Walter Raleigh and John Smith. That's good company. William Bradford labeled Thomas Weston, quote, a bitter enemy unto Plymouth upon all occasions. Which is interesting because, of course, as I said, he did manage to get them passage to New England from Leyden. And if you remember, that was not a journey without its own controversy, but Thomas Weston had made that all possible. No doubt both charges could be defended. Wessaguasset would be a disaster, as we'll soon see, but Weston did eventually end up in Maryland, where he enjoyed much success and was celebrated. So the initial settlers arrived in Plymouth in April of 1622. They came across the ocean on a vessel called the Sparrow, and it was actually heading to Maine, so once there, the colonists headed south to Plymouth. And this part was pretty well thought out and financially supported. It was in June that the main body joined them, and it's interesting how planned the commercial side of this venture was. This group came across the Atlantic on 2 vessels, the Charity and the Swan. The plan was for the Charity to sail back between England and the colony, bringing supplies to the colony and taking supplies back to England, things to sell. The Swan would stay at Massachusetts Bay Harbor. Well, they didn't know which one yet, but at harbor, and would be used for coastal navigation and trade. That's pretty slick. That's pretty expensive. They must have had big plans, great expectations for the colony. Despite their philosophical differences, the 2 groups did get along pretty well at first. The Wessaguasset folks spent a good chunk of time at Plymouth that summer while they scouted the area for their own land, and they helped with the field chores. But there were also charges of thievery. Also, they may have helped, but the folks at Plymouth were busy at that time refortifying their fences against a possible Narragansett threat. You remember, this was part of the conversation last week. This is the same time frame here. So the Pilgrims may not have gotten ahead with the added help. And they suffered thievery. And they suddenly found themselves supporting or at least guiding a bigger group than they were. So they had come in June, and by September, the colony was established. They had negotiated with the local natives for the land. I mean, at least they started out well. But these guys weren't colonists. They weren't prepared for colonial life. They consumed their supplies too quickly, so they began to steal corn from the natives. The natives looked to Plymouth for assistance. The problem is Plymouth had no authority over the Wessaguasset Colony, and this probably would have been puzzling to the natives. The idea seemed to develop that maybe the Pilgrims approved of this kind of behavior. So both colonies were a little low on food as the year progressed. Plymouth legitimately was low on food, and Wessaguasset was because of a lack of discipline. So together, the 2 groups set out to trade with the natives for their needed supplies. The group was led by Miles Standish, and they used the Swan to move up and down the coast. The biggest setback of this endeavor was that in November, on one of those excursions, Squanto got sick, and his nose began to bleed. And this was seen as a bad omen by the natives, and so it was. He died. But it went from bad to worse because the supplies that they acquired did not last. So by early 1623, the Wessaguasset leader, John Saunders, told Governor Bradford that he was unable to buy corn from the natives at an affordable price. I mean, frankly, they had been bad neighbors. His plan was then to take it by force, and Bradford told him no, that was not a good idea. Bradford's advice was to eat shellfish and ground nuts, as Plymouth was already doing. Now, Saunders was the second leader of Wessaguasset. The original guy, Richard Green, was Thomas Weston's brother-in-law. He'd already died. I mean, think about that. That's quite a year. It's a tough year for this group. The stress that they were under could explain, not excuse, but maybe explain their bad behavior. At this point, Saunders sailed north looking for food to purchase, and leader number 3 enters our story, the previously quoted Thomas Morton. Now remember, he was no friend of Plymouth. That could not have helped the deteriorating situation. I mean, who said history is boring? Wouldn't this make for a great high-budget Hollywood movie? So Wessaguasset did not have the discipline or the fortitude of Plymouth, let alone character. They were in a free fall. People were selling everything, including their clothes, to the natives for food. Some entered into servitude. They started building canoes for the natives. They were stealing from them. One man who was caught was hanged just to appease the offended party. I mean, they didn't even know if they hung the right man. They just wanted that specific threat to go away. They were dying, and they were abandoning the settlement just 6 months in, less than 6 months. I mean, and I think about it, I wonder how I'd react if I was a colonial or a native in the area or a resident of the struggling but stable Plymouth. I mean, can't you just identify with all the parties here? Empathy is not the same thing as endorsement. The Wessaguasset men had conducted themselves terribly. All the while, the Massachusetts were complaining vigorously to the folks at Plymouth, who again had no authority over Wessaguasset. A little later in the winter, Saunders, having returned, tried to convince Governor Bradford that the 2 colonies should launch a joint attack. Bradford declined the offer. The situation continued to deteriorate. the colony was simply evaporating. They'd been bad neighbors in a dangerous neighborhood where their closest neighbors were already leery of Englishmen. And it was at this time that the healing of Massasoit took place. So while the Wessaguasset Colony was in terrible decline, Plymouth had actually gotten a boost from the healing of Massasoit. It was after that healing that Massasoit gave the news of warning to Hobomok as they left his village. The plan was to destroy both the English colonies. It was almost the whole neighborhood. I mean, the Massachusetts took the lead, but there were several tribes involved. The hostilities toward Plymouth, frankly, may simply have been perceived acceptance and endorsement of Wessaguasset. As it happened, the Pilgrims' fears were confirmed by a Massachusetts native and a general coolness that had set in towards the Pilgrims by all of the surrounding natives. And lastly, a man named Phineas Pratt, a resident of Wessaguasset, traveled to Plymouth and reported that he had heard of a coming attack by a native woman. He said that it would occur as soon as the snow melted, and they had constructed enough canoes to attack the Swan, thus isolating the English and trapping them on land. This was going to be a big deal. This is a serious business. The one thing that sticks out is, as the Wessaguasset guys are hiring themselves out to the Indians, one of the reports I read said that they were hired out to actually build canoes. Now you see that the Indians are building canoes so that they can attack the colonies. It's kind of an interesting thing. They're building the canoes that would attack themselves. But the Pilgrims had to act now. Even if Wessaguasset had deserved it, they deserved to be attacked. Plymouth was also threatened at this point. I mean, sometimes in life you end up in a fight that you did not choose on a side that you would not have chosen. So on March 26, 1623, according to the Julian Calendar, the old style, I think it's April 5th. I didn't look that up recently, but I believe it was April 5th in the new style calendar, the Gregorian, that Miles Standish arrived at Wessaguasset and took over. And again, he would earn his keep. He was ready for action. He had a plan. Though there are some slightly differing accounts, the basic events of the next couple of days went something like this. When Standish arrived at the colony, he ordered all the people inside the stockade under threat of death. I mean, the residents that were left at Wessaguasset had grown accustomed to leaving the stockade to basically forage for food. Standish also took control of the supplies and he began to ration everybody. He acted as if he was only there for trade with the natives. Hobomok was there. Remember, he was a special warrior and a confidant of Massasoit. So at this point, we want to understand that some of the natives, the leaders of this plan, were known as Nice. And this was a kind of special forces native. They were exceptionally trained and disciplined. They were fearless, and it was rumored among the natives that they could not be killed in battle. So the natives were onto the Colonials. They refused to gather around Standish and his men. I mean, it seemed kind of obvious they weren't there, and now they are. They knew who Standish was. Massasoit had recommended that they lure the leaders into a hut and kill them by ambush. So in other words, assassinate them. It was good advice that had followed the warning itself. I mean, Massasoit's role fits like bookends into our story here. He warns them, but then also on the back end of this, they're going to begin to apply the advice that he had given him. So the plan was to separate a few of the leaders and overwhelm them by surprise. You cut the head off the snake, the body dies. So they lured 4 men into a hut. Now, one of these nieces was Massasoit, and he told Hobomok that he knew the English wanted to kill him, but that he had no fear of them. And there was another niece there, Wessaguasset. And together they sharpened their knives and they taunted the Pilgrims. They mocked Standish for his small stature. I mean, imagine the insolence and the palpable hatred in the air that day. They're in this little hut, this enclosed area. They're not being seen by the larger general population. Standish is in there with a few of his men. You got these 4 leaders in there. Everybody knows something's about to go down. The tension must have been thick. Now, Wessaguasset's knife that he was sharpening had the image of a woman's face on it. And he said that he had another knife at home with a man's face. And that knife, he said, the knife with the man's face, had been used to kill both French and English. And he's quoted as saying at this time, quote, "By and by these 2 must marry," end quote. Of the knife he was sharpening, he said, quote, "By and by it should see, and by it should eat, but not speak," End quote. Very ominous. And so it was about this time, at Standish's command, the attack commenced, and the goal had been to kill them quickly. Now, Wessaguasset was killed by his own knife. There's a little irony there. Wessaguasset was killed, but his brother managed to escape death during the fighting, only to be hanged afterward. I mean, this is a brutal scene. One of the natives escaped, and he obviously would run and tell the tale. The fear in the remaining natives must have been tremendous. I mean, after all, these guys are superstitious, but nieces were not supposed to fall in battle. 2 of theirs did that day. And of the killings themselves, Edward Winslow reported that those nieces, they withstood tremendous brutality. They absorbed a ton of injuries. They did not wince or back down or show any fear at their own demise. The next day, the others had regrouped, and they counterattacked. And as Standish and Hobomok observed the fighting, kind of off to the side, I guess, the Massachusetts began to aim their arrows directly at them. They must not have recognized Hobomok at first, but when he revealed himself, they fled, and he gave chase and he defeated them, because he was a well-known niece, and he was feared and he was fearful. Even in gifting the Pilgrims with Hobomok's service, Massasoit had gone above and beyond in providing for them. Massasoit's plan and Standish's execution worked perfectly. The other groups that had been involved in the plan scattered and wanted no more trouble with the English. And this is a big deal. It was really quite a gruesome deal for the size of the fight, if you think about it. I mean, these huts probably weren't very big. Look at the amount of violence that happened. It had truly been a life or death struggle for the English. The natives had been repelled. They had been chastened. And as was custom, Widow Beaumont's head was cut off and taken back to Plymouth. That's right, they took the sachem, they took the niece after he was killed in battle, and they cut his head off. And they mounted it on a pike on the fort for everybody to see as a warning. The thing that's striking to me is that the fort also doubled as a house of worship. I mean, that would be a very comforting sight, I would think, entering church, looking at a decapitated head. So as I said before, though, these folks weren't us and we're not them. They lived in a violent, dangerous world. Our world is pretty tame for most of us, even on a bad day. The mood was not at all celebratory, though, even in victory. In the aftermath, Wessaguasset disbanded. Miles Standish had offered to leave a group for defense, but that was declined. And those that were left either went to Maine or to Plymouth or headed back to England. Less than 1 year after they settled, they were gone. In the days following the battle, there were some colonists living in the area who had left the colony previously. They had left Wessaguasset and were living on their own. And they were easy targets for the Massachusetts as they exacted revenge where they could. And several months later, the area would be recolonized and renamed Weymouth after Weymouth, Dorset, England, where they had originated. And this time there were families. Imagine the bravery that these folks had. Hey, we want to go and resettle in the New World. Oh, that's great. Yeah, there's been a lot of colonies that have come and gone. That's all right. We're willing to take the risk. The place that we're going in particular, 4 months ago, there was this massacre. The colony that existed didn't anymore. And the local natives, they don't like you. They came anyways. The leader of this group was Robert Gorges. That's Ferdinando Gorges' son. You remember, he had a lot of influence in basically everything north of Virginia. But Robert Gorges didn't last. He left after 1 year, but some of those colonists remained, and they received continual support from Plymouth until they were absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Plymouth suffered for this episode as well. Relations with many of the natives took years to rebuild. This was one of those events that, it's a galvanizing event really, that caused some of the natives to actively band together with other natives as a defense against the English. So a couple of questions about this. What would you have done had you been there? What would you have done had you lived in Plymouth? How would you have felt about this as you watched this kind of play itself out? If your life was on the line, how would you have handled Wessaguasset? How would you have handled the warning signs? I mean, they seemed and turned out to be legitimate. I wonder if Plymouth could have done something different. They had no legal recourse over Wessaguasset. Don't answer that question with a 2021 mindset. I mean, think about it. Think like a 1623 guy in New England. Think about all of the sides to this equation. Plymouth's clout had just risen. I mean, they were riding high at this point. Human relationships are complicated. Diplomacy is complicated. Ideas and actions have consequences. And consequences, for those that are left living, can bring their own burden. It's much easier to judge the past than to actually live it. Just like last week, a good portion of our lives revolve around, and a good portion of the things that attract us in life to people are fidelity and mercy and graciousness. In the aftermath, many men were left to deal with their consciences. And they were challenged. The Weymouth Massacre, as it's often remembered, was relayed to John Robinson by William Bradford. Now, John Robinson had been the pastor at Leiden for the Pilgrims before they left the Netherlands and came to the New World. He was troubled by the account. He did not like the impaling of Wessaguasset's head. But we have to understand, again, not in a 2021 mindset, in a 1623 mindset. That was a relatively common action during war. And Miles Standish was a trained soldier. He did what was normal and natural to him. It wasn't that far out of the ordinary, as grotesque as it sounds. But of the whole thing, John Robinson is reported to have said, quote, "It is also a thing," now listen, quote, "It is also a thing more glorious in men's eyes than pleasing to God or convenient to Christians, to be a terror to poor, barbarous people. And indeed, I am afraid lest, by these occasions, others should be drawn to effect a kind of ruffling course in the world. Oh, how happy a thing it had been if you had converted some before you killed any." That's a powerful statement. I want to read that again. John Robinson, the pastor back in Leiden in the Netherlands, when hearing about the Weymouth Massacre, lamented and said, quote, "It is also a thing more glorious in men's eyes than pleasing to God or convenient to Christians, to be a terror to poor, barbarous people. And indeed, I'm afraid, lest by these occasions others should be drawn to effect a kind of ruffling course in the world. Oh, how happy a thing it had been if you had converted some before you killed any." Isn't that response right in line with what we already read of Thomas Morton, when he said that he saw more humanity in the Massachusetts natives than the Christians? Now, I do agree with Robinson's statements for this event. I will say it does simplify what happened, though. I always want to be careful. I don't want to swing the pendulum too far back the other way from any one position. I mean, this was a tragic situation. Somebody or someone of these groups was going to die. And remember also, Thomas Morton did not like the Pilgrims. I mean, he may have had a point. They may have not been very nice or acted in a very humane way towards the natives. Not all the time, I'm sure. But Thomas Morton also had his own demons, and he also caused his own fair amount of trouble. Now, 200 years after the Weymouth Massacre, William Apis, a Pequot, by the way, made a similar observation about the Puritans in New England when he said, quote, "How they could go to work to enslave a free people and call it religion is beyond the power of my imagination and outstrips the revelation of God's word." Did you hear that? William Apis, a Pequot, 200 years after the Weymouth Massacre, in making an observation about the Puritans in New England, said, quote, "How they could go to work to enslave a free people and call it religion is beyond the power of my imagination and outstrips the revelations of God's word." End quote. Now, notice, it was not the practice of religion that Apis dismissed. It was not the revelation of God's word that Apis dismissed. It was comparing the actions of some claiming to come in the name of God to what the revelation of God's word said. The problem Apis had was the abuse of God's word. The justification of abuse towards humans through oftentimes the application of really bad doctrine is very destructive. And to that I say amen with, again, that word of caution. You're hard-pressed to find a piece of real estate today or yesterday, anywhere, where the folks in control now did not achieve and maintain control, but by force. Or they've got really powerful friends around them protecting them. So as an armchair student of history, I just want to understand what happened. I mean, there were many significant achievements that came out of these times and out of these very people, these colonials, these Englishmen that came, were beneficiaries of a lot of the things that they accomplished. These are tough words in conjunction with the events. It causes me to reflect on what happened. I mean, these were frankly all people thrown into a meat grinder. Some of them built the meat grinder. Some jumped in voluntarily, and some got sucked into it. And it causes me to reflect on how I can maybe be a little more thankful for what I have, be a little more thoughtful in my own decisions, and a little more tempered in my opinions of other people. And so that's the end of my soapbox for this week. Next week, we'll probably conclude our focus on Massasoit. We'll also round out some of the details of Hobomok and Squanto's lives. These were very accomplished men, much more so than we usually tend to think. Well, I'll speak for myself. These were very accomplished men, much more so than I usually tend to think. And I hope that you can make it. And until then, I hope that this week's episode has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.